Bob Marley One Love from Ronaldo Marcus Green. It's a biopic about the reggae music legend and Rastafarian icon. So unlike most musician biopics that like to start the story well before the talent's rise to stardom, this one kicks things off during Bob Marley's career leading up to the Smile Jamaica concert in 1976, which was a free peace concert opposing the rise of political violence. Jamaica at the time had reached record amounts of violent crime since the country's independence in the 60s, so Bob Marley and the Wailers had planned to do this show, putting big targets on their backs. But beyond this chapter, the movie portrays some of the highlights of Bob Marley's career and personal life. So this movie reiterates one of the core themes of Bob Marley's music, which is of course peace. It's about finding peace in oneself so that you can try and share it with those around you. This message is of course delivered through music, which I'm glad there was a lot of in this movie. If you're a fan of Bob Marley's music, you're seriously in for a treat. But the depth of his message is so much deeper, knowing the hardships that he overcame in his personal life to leave such a heartfelt legacy. He's obviously well known in pop culture for being a very soulful guy who, if you're like me, you probably imagine sitting in a beanbag chair smoking reefer with a big smile on his face. And yes, the heart is very much there in this movie, and so is the weed. There's a lot of reefer in this movie, but I kind of like that it doesn't really play a hand in the narrative at all. It's just there. This movie shows us the soulful Bob Marley, but it also shows us the rest of the picture. It shows us the ugly side of his story, including complications with his wife and his manager. This is where I think the movie could potentially lose some people, because generally I think they could have shown him in a brighter light. There's plenty of him smiling and playing music, but there's also a lot of struggle and moments that make him feel kind of drab and dark. Obviously the struggle is what makes it a story, but I just feel like they could have given us a little bit more of the heartwarming icon that people see him as. Nevertheless, Kingsley Ben-Adir was pretty good in this role. I was a bit skeptical at first, but I think he did a really good job. Everything from the dialect to the varying energy that he carries from scene to scene. The cast overall was good. The characters are obviously Jamaican, and even the characters who are of a different nationality, like Kingsley for an example, did a really good job with the Jamaican accents. Because of that, there were times where, while I was less engaged, I actually missed a couple of lines of dialogue just from not quite understanding what was said. To clarify, I am not criticizing the movie for this at all. They obviously sounded very authentic and wonderful. This is me acknowledging that I messed up. I more so just want to give a PSA to any other Americans that are going to see this movie to really stay focused on the dialogue for maximum enjoyment, because sometimes it's really easy going from one scene to another to still be pondering the previous one. It's also easy to get distracted by visuals when you're watching something cinematic. But of course, there is something to be said about how easily viewers can get distracted when the overall flow of the story is unfortunately not great, because that's the biggest shortcoming of the film. The story overall felt kind of sloppy. As mentioned, this movie starts off leading up to the Smile Jamaica concert, which actually felt more climactic than the third act of the film. Like, substantially. From there, the movie becomes about the making of Exodus, and I really enjoyed this part of the film, but for a duration, it kind of just felt like they were running past the finish line. It really feels like there was a first draft of the film that was entirely pre-Exodus, that just starts off with Bob Marley's childhood, leading into the rise of his musical career, and then leading up to the Smile Jamaica show as the fitting climax. And then they just lobbed off the first two acts and said, let's just take the third act there, make it our first act for our next draft. Sprinkled throughout the film, we get random glimpses of his childhood. These flashbacks were an attempt to show us where he came from before his career. And yes, I am deliberately calling it an attempt and not a success, because they were pretty irrelevant to the main story of Bob Marley's career that the film primarily focuses on. You would think that if the story was going to take brief little breaks to show us flashbacks, that they would at least have some subtext that pertains to what's happening in present time. They did not. And even worse, they were not even in chronological order, so there wasn't even like a Chris Nolan thing where two stories are unfolding simultaneously that tie together by the end. So really, they just kind of muddled the story. I feel like there was probably a good idea there originally, and it was just forgotten about in the making of the screenplay. I mentioned earlier that there were complications with his wife and manager. I would have liked to have seen a lot more to set those up. Whenever Bob clashed with someone, it just felt kind of abrupt. Like there could have been a lot more complications leading up to an eventual boiling point, but instead it just felt like characters were going from 0 to 100 in a mere scene change. The movie is an hour and 47 minutes, which is a reasonable runtime, but For a movie about somebody this big, they could have ran it a little long to really give us a proper amount of depth and really filled in those gaps, and I wouldn't have been upset at all. Because in the end, the movie fell a little bit short on the character dynamics and backstory, which, if done better, could have made the movie feel so much bigger. Overall, this movie is very watchable and has its occasional delights. It was just a little bit shy of doing the legendary Bob Marley the justice he deserves. All things considered, it's fine. Like, really it is. I do think that anyone who is already really excited about seeing this should still go see it. There's still some good in it. But if you're hoping for an in-depth Bob Marley story, then maybe check out the 2012 documentary Marley, because that actually might scratch the itch a little bit better. Thank you for watching this review. If it brought you any value at all, please consider giving it a like. It really does help the channel grow. I'll see you later this week with my reviews of The Taste of Things and Drive Away Dolls.